She spent her last $28 on 65 starving ewes that nobody wanted. People called her crazy, but what those sheep discovered days later would save an entire farm and leave a whole town in shock. In the middle of the worst drought anyone could remember, a struggling woman named Sarah took a chance that made no sense. For just $28, she bought 65 starving ewes that were considered beyond saving. What happened next would turn a desperate gamble into a story nobody would ever forget. The drought had been going on for so long that people had stopped talking about when it might end. Across the valley, fields that once rolled with green grass had turned into endless stretches of cracked earth. Ponds had disappeared. Creeks had become dusty scars across the land. Day after day, the sun hung overhead like a hammer, beating down on farms that were already on the verge of collapse. And no one felt that pain more deeply than Sarah. At 38 years old, she had spent her entire life working the small family farm she had inherited from her father. It wasn't much, just a modest piece of land, a weathered farmhouse, and a few acres that had once provided enough to survive. But now, survival itself seemed uncertain. Each morning, Sarah walked her property with a knot in her stomach. The grass was nearly gone. Her water tanks were running dangerously low. Bills continued piling up on the kitchen table, while her savings account shrank with every passing week. Many of her neighbors had already given up. Some sold their livestock. Others packed their belongings and moved away entirely. Every time Sarah watched another truck leave the valley, she wondered if she should do the same. One evening, exhausted from another day of bad news, she stopped by a small feed store on the edge of town. A few local ranchers stood near the counter, discussing an upcoming livestock auction. Most of the conversation sounded familiar. Failing farms, dying pasture, desperate owners. Then Sarah heard something that made her pause. 65 ewes, one rancher muttered. Another shook his head. Starving, barely standing, nobody's going to touch them. The group laughed grimly. They'll be lucky to get $28 for the whole lot. Sarah couldn't explain why those words stayed with her. 65 starving ewes. Animals nobody wanted. Animals everyone had already given up on. That night, long after darkness settled over the valley, Sarah sat alone on her porch, staring across the dry land. She should have been thinking about her own problems. Instead, she kept thinking about those sheep. And before she finally went inside, she made a decision that would change her life forever. The next morning, she was going to the auction. She had no idea what was waiting for her there. The livestock auction was already crowded when Sarah arrived the next morning. Dust swirled through the parking lot as trailers rolled in one after another. Ranchers stood in small groups, sipping coffee and exchanging worried conversations about shrinking water supplies and dying pasture. Normally, auctions carried a sense of energy. Not today. The drought had drained hope from almost everyone. As Sarah stepped through the gates, she could feel it in the silence. Animals were being sold, not because owners wanted to profit, but because they had run out of options. She walked past rows of cattle, goats, and sheep, until she finally found the pen she had heard about. The moment she saw the ewes, her heart sank. There were 65 of them, or at least there had once been. Now they looked more like shadows. Their ribs pushed sharply through thin coats. Their heads hung low. Some struggled just to remain standing. Others crowded together weakly beneath the little shade available. A few barely reacted when people approached. Sarah had seen hungry animals before, but never like this. Around her, buyers glanced at the pen and quickly moved on. No value there. Waste of money. They won't last a week. The comments came one after another. Each one felt like another nail in a coffin. Yet as Sarah watched the animals, she noticed something strange. Despite their condition, they stayed together. Whenever one ewe stumbled, others shifted closer. Whenever one moved, the rest followed. It was as if they were refusing to abandon each other. Something about that quiet determination touched her. Hours later, the auction finally reached their lot. The auctioneer looked almost apologetic. 65 ewes, he called out. Who'll start the bidding? Silence. Not a single hand rose. The crowd exchanged uncomfortable looks. The auctioneer tried again. Nothing. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Sarah felt her heart pounding. She knew she shouldn't do it. Her savings were nearly gone. Her own farm was struggling. Logic told her to walk away, but logic wasn't winning. Before she could change her mind, her hands slowly lifted into the air. I'll offer $28. The crowd turned. Several people laughed. Someone actually shook his head. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. $28. Do I hear anything higher? The silence returned. No one bid. Not one person. The gavel struck. Sold. The sound echoed across the yard. Just like that, Sarah became the owner of 65 starving ewes. As the crowd dispersed, the laughter continued. But Sarah barely heard it, because standing near the edge of the pen, one of the weakest ewes suddenly lifted her head and stared toward the distant hills. And for the first time all morning, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something about that look didn't feel ordinary. Loading 65 starving ewes into the trailer took far longer than Sarah expected. Most of them were too weak to move. Some had to be gently guided forward, step by painful step. Others simply stood still, exhausted beyond reason. The workers at the auction helped where they could, but even they looked doubtful. One man leaned against the fence and shook his head. You've got a good heart, he said quietly. But sometimes a good heart isn't enough. Sarah didn't answer. Deep down, part of her feared he might be right. By the time she finally pulled onto the dusty road home, the afternoon sun was blazing overhead. Heat shimmered across the landscape, like waves rising from an open fire. The valley looked worse than ever. Fields lay barren, windmills stood motionless, dry creek beds cut across the land like scars. Every mile reminded Sarah how difficult the coming weeks would be. When she reached her farm, several neighbors noticed the trailer immediately. A few walked over to see what she had bought. The moment they looked inside, their reactions were exactly what Sarah expected. You paid money for these. They look half dead. You should have saved your cash. One neighbor actually laughed. Those sheep aren't an investment. They're a funeral procession. The words stung, but Sarah ignored them. She opened the trailer gate and patiently guided the ewes into a small pasture near the farmhouse. The animals moved slowly, painfully. Yet the moment they stepped onto the property, something unexpected happened. Instead of scattering in different directions, the flock stayed tightly grouped together. Every ewe followed the others, as if connected by an invisible thread. Sarah watched them carefully. Most exhausted animals would immediately search for shade or collapse to rest. These didn't. They seemed to be looking for something. For the next several days, Sarah worked tirelessly. She rationed feed. She carried buckets of water. She checked every animal each morning and every evening. Progress was slow. Some ewes improved slightly. Others remained dangerously weak. At night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, studying bills and calculating expenses. The numbers never looked good. With each passing day, the reality became harder to ignore. If the sheep didn't recover soon, she might lose everything. Then, on the fourth morning, something strange happened. Just after sunrise, one of the oldest ewes separated from the flock. Sarah watched from the porch as the animal slowly walked toward a barren hillside at the edge of her property. There was nothing there. No grass, no water, no shade. Yet the ewe kept climbing. A few moments later, several others followed, then more and more, until nearly the entire flock was making the same journey. Sarah frowned. The hillside was completely lifeless. There was absolutely no reason for them to go there. Yet every single day after that, the sheep returned to the exact same spot. And with each visit, their behavior became even more mysterious. For the next 3 mornings, Sarah resisted the urge to interfere. Instead, she watched. Just before sunrise, while the valley was still wrapped in cool shadows, the flock would quietly gather near the edge of the pasture. There were no loud calls, no panic, no confusion. Somehow, without a shepherd or a command, they all seemed to know exactly where they were going, and every morning they climbed the same barren hillside. Sarah couldn't understand it. The hill was the driest part of her property. Years of relentless drought had stripped away every blade of grass. The ground was nothing but cracked clay, scattered rocks, and patches of lifeless dirt. There was nothing there, at least nothing she could see. Still, the sheep kept returning. Curiosity finally got the better of her. On the 4th morning, Sarah followed them from a distance. She walked quietly, careful not to disturb the flock. The air was still, broken only by the sound of boots crunching over dry earth and the occasional bleat echoing through the valley. As the sheep reached the top of the hill, they didn't spread out to graze. Instead, they formed a loose circle. Sarah stopped behind a large boulder and watched. The oldest ewe, the same one who had first led the journey, stepped into the center of the circle. She lowered her head and sniffed the ground for several long moments. Then she began pawing at the dirt. Once, twice, 3 times. Soon another ewe joined her, then another. Within minutes, nearly a dozen sheep were scraping the hard earth with their hooves, kicking up small clouds of dust. Sarah frowned. "What are you doing?" she whispered. The soil was bone dry. There wasn't a single root, insect, or blade of grass worth searching for. Yet the flock refused to stop. For nearly 20 minutes, they dug and stamped the same small patch of ground with surprising determination. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The oldest ewe lifted her head, stared at the earth for a moment, and calmly led the flock back down the hill. Sarah hurried to the spot. She knelt and brushed away the loose dirt with her hands. Nothing, only dry clay and scattered stones. She sighed, convinced the sheep had simply been acting on instinct. But as she stood to leave, a faint breeze swept across the hillside. It carried with it a scent she hadn't smelled in months. Not dust, not dry grass. It was the unmistakable smell of damp earth. Sarah froze. She looked back at the patch of ground the sheep had been digging. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. Then she noticed something that made her pulse race. A tiny dark spot had appeared in the cracked soil. It was no bigger than a coin, but it hadn't been there a moment before. Sarah dropped to one knee, her eyes locked on the tiny dark patch in the soil. For a long moment, she simply stared. It couldn't be. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched the ground. Cool. Not wet enough to leave mud on her hand, but unmistakably cooler than the sun-baked earth surrounding it. Her heart began to race. She dug carefully with her fingertips, brushing away loose dust and pebbles. Just a few inches below the surface, the soil changed color. Instead of pale grey clay, it became darker, heavier, moist. Sarah sat back in disbelief. Months had passed without meaningful rain. Every well in the valley was dropping. Even her own water tanks were nearly empty. So where could moisture be coming from? She looked across the hillside. There was no stream, no pond, no spring, nothing but dry land stretching toward the horizon. Maybe it's just an old pocket of damp soil, she whispered, trying to convince herself. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the sheep knew something she didn't. The next morning, Sarah returned before sunrise. This time, she carried a shovel. She waited quietly behind the same boulder as the flock climbed the hill once again. Just as before, they gathered in a loose circle. The old ewe stepped forward. She sniffed the ground. Then she stamped her front hoof. One by one, the others joined in. The sound echoed across the silent hillside. Thump, thump, thump. 65 hungry ewes striking the earth in perfect rhythm. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't random. It felt almost deliberate. For nearly half an hour, they pawed and stamped the exact same spot before calmly stepping aside. Sarah didn't waste a second. The moment the flock moved away, she rushed forward and drove her shovel into the ground. The first few inches were hard as concrete. Sweat poured down her face as she dug deeper. 6 inches, 10 inches, a foot. Then, thunk. The shovel struck something solid. She knelt and cleared away the dirt with her hands. It wasn't a rock. It was a flat layer of tightly packed clay, unlike anything around it. A strange feeling settled over her, almost as if something beneath that layer had been sealed away for years. Sarah gripped the shovel tighter. Taking a deep breath, she drove it down with all her strength. The clay cracked. A thin fracture spread across its surface. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. Then a faint gurgling sound rose from below. Sarah held her breath. The crack widened. A single drop of crystal clear water slipped through the opening. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the dry earth beneath her boots began to shimmer. She stumbled backward in disbelief as the sheep rushed toward the spot, not in panic, but as if they had known all along exactly what was waiting beneath the hill. The impossible was beginning to reveal itself. Sarah stood frozen as another drop of water escaped through the cracked layer of clay. Then another. The tiny trickle quickly became a thin stream, winding its way through the dry soil before disappearing downhill. For a moment, the world seemed to fall completely silent. No wind, no birds, no distant sound of machinery, only the gentle murmur of water. Real water. Sarah blinked, wondering if the heat had finally gotten to her. She rubbed her eyes and looked again. The stream was still there, growing stronger. A laugh escaped her lips, followed almost instantly by tears. After months of praying for rain, water had been hidden beneath her own hillside the entire time. The flock slowly approached the opening. The oldest ewe stepped forward first. She lowered her head and took a careful drink. One by one, the others followed, patiently waiting their turn, as if they understood how precious every drop was. Watching them, Sarah felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude. "If it weren't for you," she whispered, "I never would have found this." She hurried back to the farmhouse, grabbed buckets, a pickaxe, and several empty barrels, then raced up the hill again. Working for hours beneath the blazing sun, she carefully widened the cracked opening. The more loose clay she removed, the stronger the flow became. Cold, clear water bubbled from deep beneath the hillside, filling a shallow channel before running down toward the pasture. By late afternoon, the once barren ground around the seep had turned dark with moisture. The sheep drank until they were satisfied. Even the weakest animals seemed more energetic than they had been in days. Sarah filled every barrel she owned. For the first time in months, she wasn't counting every single gallon. She finally had hope. But hope didn't stay secret for long. As the sun began to set, the sound of an engine echoed across the valley. A pickup truck slowed to a stop beside her fence. Then another, and another. Neighbors climbed out, staring toward the hillside, where the sunlight reflected off the fresh water. Word had spread faster than Sarah imagined. People whispered to one another, pointing at the unexpected stream. Some looked amazed. Others looked suspicious. One man stepped forward, his expression impossible to read. "I've lived in this valley for 40 years, he said quietly. "There has never been water on that hill." Sarah looked back at the flowing seep. Neither of them noticed an elderly rancher standing at the edge of the crowd. His face had gone completely pale. As he stared at the hillside, he removed his old hat and whispered words that sent a chill through everyone nearby. "I know this place." And that spring was never supposed to be found again. The valley fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward the elderly rancher. He stood motionless, his weathered hat clutched tightly against his chest, staring at the water as though he had seen a ghost. Sarah stepped closer. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked slowly toward the hillside, stopping beside the small stream. He knelt carefully, dipped his fingers into the crystal-clear water, and closed his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "I never thought I'd see this again." The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. 40 years ago, he continued, this wasn't a dry hill. There was a natural spring here. It supplied water to several ranches during the hottest summers. Sarah listened in stunned silence. "If there was a spring," she asked, "what happened to it?" The old rancher sighed deeply. "A violent storm." He pointed toward the rocky slope above them. A massive landslide crashed down the hill. It buried the spring beneath tons of clay and rock. Everyone believed it was gone forever. He shook his head slowly. "We searched for weeks. Men brought digging equipment. They tried everything, but nobody ever found it." Sarah looked down at the sheep drinking peacefully from the flowing seep. "They found it," she whispered. The old man smiled faintly. "No. They remembered it." A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd. Some laughed nervously. Others looked at the flock with newfound respect. One neighbor who had mocked Sarah at the auction stepped forward. "You're saying these sheep knew where the spring was?" The rancher shrugged. "I don't know how. But animals notice things we don't. They smell moisture. They sense changes beneath the earth. And sometimes," he looked directly at the oldest ewe, "they remember paths their ancestors walked long before we arrived." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the gentle trickle of water flowing down the hillside. Then another voice broke the silence. "What happens now?" Heads turned toward a wealthy ranch owner named Walter Briggs. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't smiling. His eyes weren't fixed on the sheep. They were fixed on the water. Walter slowly walked around the seep, studying every inch of the hillside, as if measuring its value. Finally, he looked at Sarah. "You know," he said calmly, "that spring sits right on the edge of your property line." Sarah's smile faded. "What are you saying?" Walter folded his arms. "I'm saying, the boundary markers around this hill haven't been surveyed in decades." The crowd fell silent again. "If that spring isn't legally yours," he paused, letting the words sink in, "then neither is the water." Sarah's heart dropped. She had just found the miracle she'd prayed for. Now someone was already trying to take it away. Sarah barely slept that night. Walter's words echoed through her mind over and over. If that spring isn't legally yours, then neither is the water. She had spent months fighting the drought. She had risked her last $28 on 65 starving ewes that everyone else had abandoned. And now, just as hope had finally returned, someone wanted to claim the one thing that could save her farm. At sunrise, she walked back to the hillside. The seep was still flowing. Not fast, but steady. The old ewe stood nearby, calmly watching the water trickle down into the pasture. The rest of the flock grazed on patches of fresh green shoots that had begun to appear around the damp soil. It was incredible. Only a few days earlier, the hill had been nothing but cracked earth. Now, life was quietly returning. As Sarah knelt beside the spring, she heard footsteps behind her. It was the elderly rancher. He carried a faded leather satchel tucked beneath his arm. "I thought you might want to see something," he said. From the satchel, he carefully removed a rolled piece of yellowed paper tied with a worn leather strap. Its edges were brittle with age. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "My grandfather's map." He spread it across a flat rock. It was a hand-drawn survey of the valley from nearly 70 years earlier. Old fence lines, trails, and creeks were marked in faded black ink. Near the center of the map was a small blue circle. Beside it, written in careful handwriting, were 3 words: Shepherd's Hill Spring. The old rancher smiled. "My grandfather helped build the first fences in this valley." He pointed to the map. "The spring has always been on this property. Sarah compared the drawing to the landscape around them. The landmarks matched perfectly. The ancient oak, the rocky ridge, even the curve of the hillside. Walter had been wrong. The spring belonged to her farm all along. Relief washed over Sarah. But it lasted only a moment. The distant growl of engines echoed across the valley. She looked toward the road. 3 pickup trucks were climbing the hill. Walter Briggs stepped out of the first one. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 surveyors climbed out behind him, carrying measuring equipment and bright orange marker flags. Walter adjusted his hat and smiled politely. "I hope you don't mind," he called. "We're here to settle this. Officially." Sarah folded the old map carefully in her hands. The elderly rancher leaned closer and whispered, "Keep that map safe. Because before this day is over, someone may try to make it disappear." Walter's surveyors spent the entire morning pacing the hillside. They drove small stakes into the ground, stretched measuring tape between old fence posts, and compared their notes with modern survey equipment. Sarah stood quietly beside the spring, clutching the faded map the elderly rancher had entrusted to her. The flock remained close by. The old ewe never wandered far from the water, calmly watching the strangers, as though she understood what was at stake. Hours passed. Finally, one of the surveyors removed his hat and walked toward Walter. He didn't look pleased. "We've checked it 3 times, he said. "The old boundary markers are still here." He pointed to a weathered stone half buried beneath the grass. "It matches the original survey." Walter frowned. "What does that mean?" The surveyor looked directly at Sarah. "It means the spring is on her property." For several long seconds, Walter said nothing. His jaw tightened. Without another word, he climbed into his truck, slammed the door, and drove away, followed by the other vehicles. A cloud of dust swallowed the road behind them. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The spring was hers. But instead of celebrating alone, she made a decision that surprised everyone. The very next morning, she placed a wooden sign beside the hillside. It read, "Water for anyone in need. No fees, no conditions, no questions asked." One by one, neighbors began arriving with empty barrels and water tanks. Families whose wells had nearly run dry filled containers with tears in their eyes. Ranchers brought thirsty cattle. Children laughed as they splashed their hands in clean, cold water for the first time in months. The valley slowly began to change. The stream fed Sarah's pasture first. Within weeks, faint green shoots spread across the once barren hillside. The 65 ewes grew stronger every day. Their dull coats became thick and healthy. The animals that had once looked too weak to survive now wandered confidently through fields that were coming back to life. The same neighbors who had laughed at Sarah's $28 purchase now stopped by simply to thank her. Some offered hay. Others repaired broken fences. A few volunteered to help maintain the spring. The drought had nearly destroyed the community. But somehow, compassion had started rebuilding it. As the sun set one evening, Sarah watched the flock grazing peacefully around the hillside. The old ewe lifted her head and looked toward the spring one last time before quietly rejoining the others. Sarah smiled. She had rescued those sheep believing she was saving them. Now she understood the truth. From the very beginning, they had been leading her here. By the end of the summer, the valley no longer looked like the place people had almost abandoned. The cracked fields that had once stretched for miles were slowly turning green again. Wildflowers began appearing along the banks of the little stream, and birds returned to the trees that had stood silent for months. The sound of flowing water had replaced the eerie stillness that Drought had left behind. Sarah often stood on the hillside at sunrise, watching the 65 ewes graze peacefully. It was hard to believe they were the same animals people had called hopeless. Their coats were thick again, their eyes were bright. Lambs soon began appearing in the pasture, filling the farm with new life and joyful bleats. The flock that nobody wanted had become the heart of the valley. News of the remarkable discovery spread far beyond the county. Farmers, reporters, and curious travelers came to see the spring for themselves. They all asked Sarah the same question. "How did you know where to dig?" She always smiled and gave the same answer. "I didn't. The sheep did." Some believed it was instinct. Others called it luck. A few even called it a miracle. Sarah never argued with any of them, because deep in her heart, she knew one thing for certain. Kindness had led her to the moment that changed everything. Months later, the local community gathered on the hillside for a small celebration. Children ran through the fresh grass, while neighbors shared food, laughter, and stories. Beside the spring, they placed a simple wooden sign that read, "Shepherd's Spring, rediscovered by 65 forgotten ewes and one woman who refused to give up." As the crowd applauded, Sarah quietly slipped away to the pasture. The old ewe was standing alone near the water's edge. Slowly, Sarah knelt beside her and gently stroked her weathered face. "Thank you," she whispered. The ewe nudged Sarah's hand before calmly walking back to the flock. Sarah watched them disappear across the green hillside, tears filling her eyes. She realized that the greatest miracle wasn't the hidden spring beneath the earth. It was discovering that compassion can uncover hope where everyone else sees only loss. The $28 she had spent hadn't simply bought 65 starving ewes. It had bought a second chance, not just for the sheep, not just for her farm, but for an entire community that had almost forgotten how powerful hope can be. And sometimes, the greatest treasures in life aren't found by those searching the hardest. They're found by those who choose kindness when everyone else walks away. Because on that forgotten hillside, 65 starving ewes didn't just find water. They led an entire valley back to life. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't begin with wealth, power, or perfect timing. They begin with a single act of compassion, when someone chooses to help what everyone else has already given up on. Sarah thought she was rescuing 65 starving ewes. In the end, they rescued her, her farm, and an entire community. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video, because every like helps inspiring stories like this reach more people. And if you believe that kindness always finds its way back, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We share powerful, emotional stories that remind us hope can appear in the most unexpected places. Finally, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Sarah? Would you have risked your last $28 to save those forgotten sheep? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.